There is an impossible problem at the heart of America's national parks. After all, they are tasked simultaneously with protecting the country's natural, cultural, and historic resources, while at the same time making those resources available for the public to view, visit, and enjoy. Take, for instance, the hotly debated topic of entrance reservations. Parks like Rocky Mountain, Arches, Glacier, Zion, Mount Rainier, and others have implemented a reservation system of some form in recent years, either for the whole park or just for certain areas. At the heart of these timed entry systems is a question of resource conservation versus public access, as parks struggle with the impacts that increased visitation has on the very resources they are tasked with protecting. This is the impossible problem, and it applies to more than just timed entry reservations. Whether we're talking about constructing roads, restaurants, or hotels that increase public access, or through trail closures, seasonal restrictions, or lottery applications that limit it, this problem is on full display on a daily basis for visitors to see. This problem has come to be known as the dual mandate. And in this video, I want to share with you its origins and how America's Best Idea navigates the often murky waters of balancing people with nature. Alright, so the dual mandate comes from a little piece of legislation called the National Park Service Organic Act, which is just the law that created the National Park Service. Kind of important. It's a short law, like 2 pages, link in the description if you want to go and read it. Now, one thing we should note here is that national parks themselves actually predate the National Park Service. Kind of confusing, I know, but here's how it went down. We start with Yellowstone in 1872. Famously the first national park in the world, kind of, I have a whole video on that. Then we start adding a bunch more after this whole national park thing starts getting popular. We add Yosemite, officially, in 1890, along with Sequoia and Kings Canyon, known then as General Grant. Mount Rainier comes along in 1899, Crater Lake in 1902, Wind Cave in 1903, Mesa Verde in 1906. We are creating a lot of parks, basically. But there is no centralized agency overseeing them. There is no National Park Service at this time. That all changes in 1916 with the passage of the National Park Service Organic Act, which, as we have seen, creates the National Park Service and really the national park system as we know it today. When this act was passed, there were 31 national parks and monuments in the United States, and they were all pretty much operated and managed independently of one another. Today, though, there are more than 431 national park units spread across a dizzying array of different designations. But most importantly, those 431 units are part of a unified system, and they are overseen by a single agency, the National Park Service, according to a unifying set of values and principles. Where might those values and principles come from, you may ask? Good question. For that, we look back to our good friend, the National Park Service Organic Act, which has not a lot to say on the matter, actually. You would think that the legislation authorizing a National Park Service might have something to say on the purpose of said service and the way it ought to operate in order to achieve that purpose laid out for us in a robust and comprehensive legislative mandate, but the Organic Act does not have that. Instead, it gives us a single sentence, known now as the Statement of Fundamental Purpose, which essentially lays out the values and principles that every national park unit in America today now operates by. I will read this sentence to you now in full because it is perhaps the most critical sentence in the history of national parks in America. It reads, quote, "The service thus established shall promote and regulate the use of the federal areas known as national parks, monuments, and reservations hereinafter specified by such means and measures as conform to the fundamental purpose of the said parks, monuments, and reservations. And here's the important part, which purpose is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. A mouthful, I know, but that last part, which purpose is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations, is the dual mandate. That one sentence lays out for us the fundamental mission of the national parks, where if you parse through all the wordy jargon, all it comes down to is protect the resources and provide public access. If only it were that simple. Because while the Organic Act lays out for us that mission, albeit very briefly, it does not lay out how that mission should be accomplished and by which means. It does not provide us with a comprehensive set of values and principles that national parks should abide by, and it does not give a structure to the overall management mandate. It is a bare-bones skeleton framework intended simply to create a national park service and imbue it with a simple idealistic statement of purpose. How that is achieved is largely a DIY affair, which is basically what the National Park Service has done. They have codified their interpretation of the National Park Service Organic Act in a series of management principles and guidelines called, well, they're just called the management policies. It's a very boring name, and the document is like almost 200 pages long. You can find the description if you want. But this document, last updated in 2006, is like the National Park Bible. This is what they use to manage the national park system. These are the values and principles and guidelines that are applied in everyday use across the national park system in order to achieve the fundamental purpose laid out in the Organic Act. Now, frankly, most of this document is completely irrelevant to us for this discussion. It's very in the weeds, but there is some higher level stuff in here that is very relevant, in particular to this discussion of the dual mandate. To illustrate how the Park Service interprets this mandate, let me read to you this from a section entitled The MPS Obligation to Conserve and Provide for Enjoyment of Park Resources and Values. It states, quote, Congress, recognizing that the enjoyment by future generations of the national parks can be ensured only if the superb quality of park resources and values is left unimpaired, has provided that when there is a conflict between conserving resources and values and providing for the enjoyment of them, conservation is to be predominant. This is how courts have consistently interpreted the Organic Act. Okay, there you have it. That is pretty cut and dry. By the Park Service's standards, the same ones they use to manage the day-to-day operations of our national parks, when there is a conflict between conservation and public access, conservation should take precedent. That's how the Park Service sees it, that's how the courts have seen it, and frankly, a lot of historians will argue that that was the original intention of the Organic Act all along. So, essentially, these management policies kind of like staple on some muscles to the skeleton framework of the somewhat ambiguous language of the Organic Act, and if you read the other 180 pages of the document, you'll see that they continue to add on to this skeleton framework with like a circulatory system and a nervous system and organs. I don't know why I'm continuing with this analogy. It's kind of pretty much broken down at this point. Just know that these management policies continue to flesh out, how national parks should be managed according to the intent of the Organic Act. These are their interpretation of the dual mandate and how they should go about achieving it. But what these management policies are not is legislation. They are written by the Park Service and carried out by them daily, but they are not a law. Still, the only laws outlining any sort of overriding mission for the National Park Service and imbuing it with a legislative mandate are the Organic Act of 1916 and two pieces of legislation in the 1970s that essentially just reaffirmed the agency's conservation mandate. And so the question I found myself asking with all of this was, is that a bad thing? Is it a bad thing that the Park Service does not have a more robust set of legislative guidelines that outline how it should achieve its stated purpose? I mean, other federal land management agencies have this. The BLM has the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA. Fish and Wildlife has the National Wildlife Refuge System Administration Act, and the Forest Service has the National Forest Management Act. Is it a bad thing that there isn't a National Park Service Administration Act or a National Park Management Act? Luckily for me and for you, other people much smarter than me have had this same question, and from what I have gathered, the answer is no. It's not a bad thing. Rather, it can be a good thing because it gives the Park Service a sort of flexibility to adapt to changing times. A variety of situations have arisen since the passage of the Organic Act that the writers of it probably never could have imagined. I doubt they foresaw over 300 million visitors to national parks, or the revolutions in transportation technology that would bring those visitors to them, or the invention of a little device that gives you all of human knowledge at your fingertips. They certainly didn't foresee climate change and the challenges it poses for national parks. All of these issues and others require creative, innovative solutions, and rather than be bogged down in the minutiae of a burdensome legislation, the Park Service has the ability to adapt and respond quickly, just like we're seeing with insurance reservations. That's a perfect example. And so when it comes to this idea of the dual mandate and the incredibly unique mission the National Park Service is tasked with overseeing, I think less is more. Certainly, the Organic Act and its minimalist language has caused more than one headache over the years, but look at the changes the world has gone through since it was enacted. Look at how national parks have changed and how our own perceptions of them have changed. A more flexible Organic Act has allowed the national park system to implement the dual mandate according to those changing times. You know, I've made videos about how they used to push bonfires into the Yosemite Valley and how they used to feed bears garbage in Yellowstone. Both of those things were happening under the dual mandate, and neither of them happen now because times have changed. We didn't change the dual mandate, we just adapted it to new situations as they arose. Today, we have issues like climate change and crowding that pose serious challenges to our national parks. And yet, the dual mandate is still around. And I think we can use it to face those challenges head on. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the dual mandate. Do you think it should be updated? Is it still relevant? What are your thoughts on the flexibility it provides? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, direct support on Patreon is always appreciated, and be sure to follow me on Instagram to keep up with my park adventures and channel updates. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.